Imagine you're deep in the pitch-black waters of the South Pacific. It's November 1942. The stars are swallowed by overcast skies. The ocean is deathly quiet except for the low rumble of engines and the distant creaking of steel hulls cutting through the waves. Somewhere in that dark abyss, two mighty forces are drifting toward a confrontation, and one of them doesn't even know it's already lost. Welcome to the Battle of Guadalcanal, the night the U.S. Navy changed the game forever. And here's the twist. They didn't do it with more ships, better guns, or a surprise ambush.
If you enjoyed this breakdown, don't forget to like, subscribe, and drop a comment. Your feedback helps shape what we cover next, and you being here keeps the conversation going. Thanks for watching. See you in the next one.
No, they did it with something invisible. Something the Japanese Navy couldn't see, couldn't hear, and couldn't counter. Radar. Now, that might not sound earth-shattering today. Radar is just part of life, right? Cars have it. Your phone probably has some version of it. But back then, radar was sorcery. And on the night of November 15th, aboard the USS Washington, it became the most decisive weapon in naval history. But before we get to the moment that left Japanese officers stunned, let's set the scene. Up to this point in World War II, the Imperial Japanese Navy had one thing down cold: night combat. They trained obsessively for it. Their optical equipment, rangefinders, binoculars, and torpedoes were the best in the world. Their ships slipped through the shadows like phantoms. American forces, on the other hand, they struggled. Time and again, U.S. ships got shredded at night because they simply couldn't see the enemy. The debacle at Savo Island. A brutal reminder of how ill-prepared the U.S. was when the sun went down. But that's where the magic of radar comes in. Specifically, the SG surface search radar. This wasn't some experimental gear duct taped to a mast. It was a polished, powerful new system developed with help from British magnetron technology so sensitive, it could detect a battleship from 28,000 yards away. That's over 15 miles. In total darkness. Through rain, fog, smoke, the works. It even displayed contacts on a circular plan position indicator, basically the ancestor of your modern GPS screen. This was next-level tech. But the real key? Someone had to trust it. Enter Admiral Willis Augustus Lee. Now, Lee was no ordinary officer. He wasn't just a veteran of battleships or some bureaucratic strategist. He was an Olympic gold medalist in marksmanship, no joke. He once shot targets while skiing. The man understood ballistics down to the grain. And more importantly, he understood data. When radar entered the picture, Lee didn't just tolerate it, he embraced it. He trained his crews relentlessly, drilled them in tracking, targeting, adjusting fire using radar readings alone. He didn't see radar as a novelty. He saw it as the future. And in the chaos of Guadalcanal, that future arrived like a lightning strike. The Japanese had dispatched the battleship Kirishima, a massive vessel armed to the teeth to wipe out the fragile American foothold on the island. Escorting it were cruisers and destroyers, trained and ready to strike in the dead of night. They expected another easy win. They did not expect what was waiting for them. The USS Washington and her sister ship South Dakota were moving in silently. The American fleet had learned sometimes the hard way that fighting Japan at night using optics alone was suicide. But this time, they had radar, real-time, precision data. And Lee was at the helm, calm and calculated, trusting the dots on a screen over the temptation to wait for visual confirmation. The Washington's radar picked up Kirishima 8 miles away, well beyond visual range. In the dark, the Japanese fleet was practically blind. They didn't know Washington had them in her sights. Didn't know their position had already been triangulated. Didn't know they were seconds from being lit up like fireworks on New Year's Eve. And then Lee gave the order. The Washington opened fire. Her massive 16-inch guns roared into the night, slinging 1-ton shells across 8 miles of ocean with lethal precision. Not wild shots, not guesses. These were radar-guided rounds calculated to hit with surgical accuracy. The Japanese barely had time to react before Kirishima was torn apart. Within 7 minutes, Kirishima was crippled. Fires raged across her decks. Her rudder jammed. Ammunition exploded. The crew, stunned and overwhelmed, scrambled to abandon ship. She sank not long after, marking the first time in history that a battleship had been destroyed almost entirely by radar-directed gunfire. That moment shattered the myth of Japanese invincibility at night. More than that, it changed the rules of naval warfare forever. Because once the U.S. Navy realized what radar could do, there was no going back. Night engagements were no longer blind brawls in the dark. They became precision hunts. From that point forward, Japanese forces avoided night battles.
If you enjoyed this breakdown, don't forget to like, subscribe, and drop a comment. Your feedback helps shape what we cover next, and you being here keeps the conversation going. Thanks for watching. See you in the next one.
The very thing they had once dominated had turned into a death trap, thanks to one quiet innovation and a commander who trusted it. But let's not forget the unsung heroes of this story. While the spotlight often lands on admirals and guns, it was the radar operators, those quiet, ghostly figures hunched over glowing screens, who made it all possible. Teenagers, 20-somethings, barely older than high school kids, interpreting blips and bearings under pressure that would make most people crack. There were no second chances. One misreading, one missed target, and entire ships could vanish. They didn't miss. They watched those Japanese ships crawl across their scopes and guided the Washington like a predator in the deep. And when the shells landed, boom, they watched the blips disappear. That's the kind of contribution that doesn't make headlines but rewrites history. After Guadalcanal, radar didn't just stay on battleships, it spread. Destroyers, cruisers, aircraft carriers, even submarines were outfitted with increasingly advanced systems. And with each battle, the American Navy got better, more efficient, more lethal. Radar operators trained like warriors. Gunnery teams synchronized like clockwork. By 1944, night combat wasn't a challenge for the U.S. Navy, it was a trap they laid for the enemy. But radar's impact didn't stop at surface warfare. It redefined everything. Air defense. Radar let American carriers spot incoming bombers long before they reached strike range. Navigation. Radar guided fleets through typhoons and tight straits. Submarine hunting. Radar-equipped patrols became nightmare fuel for Japanese U-boats. It was electromagnetic dominance, and it was total. And all of it traces back to that one night, that one decision, that moment where Willis Lee looked at a screen, trusted the data, and said, "Fire." It's poetic, really. The Japanese Navy had trained for decades to master the darkness. They taught their sailors to see without seeing. But in the end, the darkness turned on them, because while they hunted shadows, the Americans learned to see with radio waves, and that changed the Pacific theater forever. Today, if you dive off Guadalcanal, you can still find remnants of Hiroshima, scattered steel, twisted wreckage, a monument to the moment the world changed. Oceanographers eventually found it, lying broken in the deep, like a relic from another dimension. And somewhere, in the vast memory of that battle faint, almost forgotten, are the radar pings that marked her doom. And yet, so few know this story. So many of the people who made it happen stayed anonymous. No medals, no fame, just quiet pride in knowing they were there, flipping switches, tracking bearings, and turning the tide of a global war one blip at a time. They didn't shout, they didn't pose, they just rewrote the rules and let history catch up. So next time someone talks about game changers in war, about heroes and high-tech weapons, remember this night. Remember the USS Washington, the radar operators in the dark, and the ship that never saw it coming. And ask yourself, would you have trusted the screen? Would you have fired? Because that, right there, is what separates old war from modern warfare. Not just who shoots first, but who sees first, and who believes what they see. Because while the shells were flying and the Hiroshima was unraveling in fire and twisted steel, something far more subtle was happening, something psychological, something spiritual, almost. The Japanese Navy, up to that point, had built an empire on confidence, on precision, on an identity forged in discipline and technical mastery. They believed, rightfully so, that they were the undisputed kings of the night sea. Their crews trained religiously for nocturnal operations. They could execute torpedo spreads in total darkness with a surgeon's calm. They could identify ships by silhouette alone. For years, this gave them a devastating edge. They won battles not just with their weapons, but with the psychological upper hand. They were the ones who disappeared into the shadows and struck with ghostly precision. So imagine what it felt like that night on the bridge of a Japanese warship when explosions started erupting in the dark, and you didn't even know where they were coming from. Imagine standing in a control room, squinting into binoculars, seeing nothing but black, and suddenly your sister ship is burning from the inside out. No torpedo wake, no muzzle flash, just thunder from the abyss. It must have felt like being hunted by an invisible god. And that's what radar did. It changed the fundamental feel of naval combat. It introduced a new kind of warfare, one where information beat instinct, and silence could kill. Suddenly, it wasn't about who had better eyesight or keener instincts. It was about who had the better signal, the better math, the better machine. Let's be clear, radar wasn't sexy. It wasn't a giant cannon or a gleaming aircraft. It was a spinning antenna, a cathode ray screen, and a mess of wires and humming boxes hidden deep in the ship. It didn't make headlines. It didn't get war bonds raised, but in terms of raw, battle-altering impact, it was a nuke in the form of knowledge, and the Washington's 7-minute execution of the Hiroshima was proof. Now, after that night, the entire Pacific theater began to shift. This wasn't a one-time tech fluke. This was the new normal. Suddenly, Japanese commanders had to think twice about operating at night. The American radar advantage was spreading and it was improving. Every month, new upgrades, tighter calibration, better operator training, more integrated fire control. And the Japanese, they were caught flat-footed. They had no comparable system. They tried to counter with aggressive maneuvering, with luck, with bravery, and let's be honest, they had all three in spades, but you can't outmaneuver physics. You can't outflank a ship that already has you painted on a screen, knows your range, speed, heading, and is calculating your next move before you've even made it. There's a certain helplessness in that. A collapse of control. One moment that drives this home. After the battle, survivors from the Hiroshima were rescued by Japanese destroyers. One officer reportedly asked, "What ship hit us?" Because even after the engagement, they still weren't entirely sure what happened. They never saw the Washington. Not clearly. They didn't get a fair fight. From their perspective, it was like being sucker punched by a ghost. That right there, that confusion is how empires crumble. Not in fire and fury, but in silence and uncertainty. Meanwhile, back on the American side, there was a mix of awe and validation. The men who trained with radar, trusted it, and fought for its implementation. They were finally vindicated. They weren't fringe tech evangelists anymore. They were the new architects of naval warfare. You could almost hear the gears of military doctrine grinding into motion. After Guadalcanal, the Navy doubled down. They rolled radar into everything. Anti-air batteries, search planes, submarines. They didn't just use it to spot ships anymore, they used it to anticipate patterns, enemy routes, supply lines, ambush points. They began conducting entire operations based on radar intelligence. And for Admiral Wellesley, that moment sealed his legacy. He wasn't just a tactician. He was a believer. He had backed a system most of the old guard didn't fully understand. And when the shells hit their mark, his faith in that buzzing, blinking, ghostly technology was rewarded. But let's not forget, Lee didn't win that battle alone. He won it because his crews were ready. His radar teams were trained, drilled, and trusted. There was no panic in those control rooms. No hesitation. Just calm voices confirming bearings, calculating trajectories, and calling the shots. That's the part of war people forget. The quiet professionalism. We love to talk about heroics and last stands and flashy battles. But so often, the most world-changing moments come from people doing their jobs perfectly in the shadows. A 19-year-old technician watching a green blip move across a screen, reporting calmly to a gunnery officer, target bearing 048, range 18,200 yards. Closing fast. That's history being made. And speaking of history, this battle was more than a tactical win. It was a turning point. Because once the Americans had proof that radar worked this well in combat, it was like flipping a switch. The entire doctrine shifted. Night was no longer a threat. It was a weapon. The Americans started choosing to fight at night. They welcomed it, sought it out, because the darkness no longer belonged to the enemy. It belonged to the ones who could see without seeing. Let's pause on that thought for a second, because there's something deeply poetic about that, isn't there? The side that could see in the dark without light wins the war. It's almost biblical, like some kind of divine metaphor for enlightenment versus tradition, future versus past. One fleet trusting its eyes, the other trusting its signals. One relying on instinct, the other on data. And the moment those shells landed on Hiroshima, that debate was settled. For good. And yes, the Japanese adapted. They tried to build radar. They even succeeded in limited ways. But it was too late. The Americans were already generations ahead, training, integrating, evolving. But let's bring it back to that night. That moment. That ship. The USS Washington didn't just sink a battleship. It sank an idea, the belief that combat was always a contest of human senses. That war had to be fought eye to eye, gun to gun, like a duel. What Washington proved was that war had changed. And for every sailor who stood on deck that night, watching tracers vanish into the void. For every radar operator squinting at a blurry screen, trusting that the blip was real. For every commander who put faith in machines and math over gut instinct, they weren't just fighting a battle. They were writing a new chapter in the history of war. And they didn't do it with glory speeches or flag waving. They did it in total darkness, silently, perfectly, one radar ping at a time. So next time you hear someone talk about the turning points of World War II Midway, D-Day, Iwo Jima, remember the Battle of Guadalcanal. Remember the Washington. Remember the radar screen glowing quietly in the dark. Because that, more than anything, was the sound of the future arriving. And it didn't make a sound. It just blinked. And then it fired. Not with a bang or a grand declaration, but with a single rotation of a radar dish in the Pacific night. With a faint electric hum, a circle of light sweeping across a darkened screen. No fanfare. No trumpets. Just a green blip on a monitor and a voice saying, "Target acquired." That's how quietly revolutions happen sometimes. You see, the story of the USS Washington and the sinking of the Kirishima isn't just about the victory itself. It's about how the future crept up on the past, tapped it on the shoulder, and pulled the trigger before it ever had a chance to turn around. That's what made this moment so devastating, so irreversible. The Japanese weren't just outgunned, they were outdated. And they didn't even know it until they were already burning. That kind of shock, it doesn't fade easily. You better believe word of the battle spread like wildfire through the Pacific Fleet. Ships that were still half skeptical about radar. Not anymore. Crews who thought it was just some fancy detection tool. They were suddenly begging for more training, more upgrades, more integration into their systems. The Washington didn't just kill a battleship, it killed doubt. And from that moment on, the US Navy shifted its weight behind radar with full force. And yet so few of the people who made that victory possible ever got credit. The spotlight naturally fell on Admiral Lee, and sure, it should have. The man trusted the tech and took the risk. But behind that trust were dozens of sailors, engineers, and technicians who spent months getting those systems ready. Who stayed up all night fine-tuning equipment that nobody fully understood yet. Who sat, in the heat and the noise and the pressure, watching tiny pulses on a flickering screen and made the call. That's them. Fire. The tech revolution that reshaped modern warfare started not with glory, but with classified files and forgotten names. That's how the world turns, sometimes off the backs of people who never even got a thank you card. But let's bring this back to the bigger picture, because what happened that night was bigger than just one battle. It signaled the death of an era, the last breath of the old way of doing things, of wooden eyes scanning the horizon, of instincts and gut feelings guiding warships through the night. It was a final warning to any commanders still clinging to the past: evolve or perish. And most did evolve. Quickly, desperately. Because war doesn't wait for you to catch up. Thanks so much for watching. If you made it all the way to the end, you're officially part of the small percentage of people who don't just click away, and that means a lot. Before you go, I'd love to hear from you. Drop a comment below and tell me your thoughts, your ideas, or even what you'd like to see next. I read every single one of them, and your feedback genuinely shapes the direction of this channel. If you enjoyed the video, tap that like button. It tells YouTube this content is worth sharing. And if you haven't already, hit subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next upload. We've got more exciting videos coming, and trust me, you'll want to be here for them. This channel is just getting started, and your support helps it grow faster than you realize. Thank you again for spending a part of your day here with me. Stay curious, stay motivated, and as always, take care of yourself. Until next time, I'll see you in the next video.